How do you send a message to an enemy army that has just chained your soldiers to bridges? Not a diplomatic letter, not a statement from a ministry, a personal message from a sovereign to a commanding officer, delivered on the worst night of his career, in a bunker in the mountains of eastern Bosnia, while shells were still landing outside. 33 soldiers of the Royal Welch Fusiliers had been taken hostage at gunpoint and dispersed as human shields across enemy territory. Their commanding officer was sitting in the dark with the sound of artillery in the walls and 33 sets of family addresses on his desk, trying to decide what to write to the people who were watching the news in Wales and waiting for a phone call that was not coming. That night, a message arrived from Buckingham Palace. The Queen's words contained a certainty that no general on the ground could honestly have guaranteed, and no politician in Westminster would have dared to put in writing. Tell me in the comments, did you know that the Royal Welch Fusiliers saved an entire city from genocide, and that almost nobody outside Wales has ever heard of it? Stay with me until the end, because what these soldiers did in those mountains, and what their queen said about them on the night everything went wrong, will give you chills. Let's go. The country those soldiers were sent to protect had been destroying itself for 3 years before any of them arrived. Bosnia had declared independence from Yugoslavia in the spring of 1992. The Bosnian Serbs, armed with weapons inherited from the collapsing Yugoslav People's Army, had responded with a campaign of ethnic cleansing that would produce the worst atrocity on European soil since the Second World War before it was finished. The scale of what happened in those mountains and valleys in the opening years of the conflict is difficult to absorb even now, 3 decades later. 2 million people were driven from their homes. Entire villages were emptied at gunpoint. Men were separated from their families and taken to locations from which they didn't return. Women were subjected to systematic rape as a weapon of war. The killing was cold-blooded, racially motivated, and conducted with a bureaucratic thoroughness that recalled the very darkest chapters of the century just ending. And it was happening on television screens across the continent in real time, a broadcast into living rooms in Britain and France and Germany and America, watched by governments that were searching for a response that would appear decisive without actually requiring them to fight a war. The United Nations sent a protection force. Britain deployed its first troops in November of 1992. John Major convened the London Conference, helped establish the Sarajevo airlift, and committed the United Kingdom to what he described as a moral responsibility that could not be set aside while Europe burned. These commitments were genuinely meant. The problem was not the sincerity of the politicians who made them. The problem was the mandate under which the soldiers were deployed, which contained a contradiction so fundamental that it made the entire mission structurally impossible from the beginning. The soldiers were there to deter attacks, not to stop them. They were authorized to use force only in self-defense. They were not there to protect the civilian population in any meaningful military sense of that word. They were there to be present, to be seen, to carry the moral weight of international concern into a situation that required rather more than moral weight. A later United Nations assessment calculated that 9 full battalions were needed to defend Gorazde alone. 1 2/3 were deployed. The mathematics of that decision would eventually express itself in human terms, as mathematics always does. There was a further problem embedded in the machinery of the mission, one that the Bosnian Serb army had studied carefully and understood better than the people it was designed to constrain. Any NATO airstrike against Bosnian Serb forces required simultaneous approval from both the United Nations and from NATO itself, through separate chains of command running through different headquarters on different continents in different time zones. This system had been designed to prevent hasty or disproportionate military action. What it produced in practice was a situation in which rapid response was structurally impossible, in which the commander on the ground could identify the target and could not authorize the strike, in which the Bosnian Serb army could calculate with some precision exactly how long it would take the international community to find its keys. They had been making that calculation for 3 years. They were very good at it. And they were about to use that knowledge against a regiment from Wales that had been keeping the peace in a valley surrounded by cliffs since the first day of March, 1995. The town of Gorazde sat in a valley in eastern Bosnia, enclosed on every side by cliffs that gave any force occupying the heights a commanding artillery position over everything below. All the Muslim-majority towns in the surrounding region had already fallen to Bosnian Serb forces in the first months of the war. Foča had fallen. Rogatica had fallen. Visegrad had fallen. Gorazde was the last Bosniak stronghold in the southern Bosnian Podrinje region, a pocket of resistance in a landscape that had otherwise been reorganized along ethnic lines by force of arms. The people inside it knew what falling would mean, because they had watched what had happened to the people in the towns that had already fallen. So did the army surrounding it on 3 sides, heavy with weapons and waiting for the order that would let them finish the job. And so, eventually, would the regiment of Welsh soldiers sent to stand between them and the town they intended to take. The 1st of March, 1995, was the Feast of St. David, the patron saint of Wales, and the regimental day of the Royal Welch Fusiliers, the date the regiment had observed without interruption since its founding in 1689. It was the regimental day, and it was the day Lieutenant Colonel Jonathon Riley led 2/3 of the 1st Battalion through the front lines and into the enclave of Gorazde, to relieve the unit they were replacing and assume United Nations responsibility for the most dangerous posting in the most dangerous country in Europe. Riley was 40 years old. He had joined the army in 1973 and had spent 22 years turning himself into precisely the kind of officer who was very difficult to manage from a comfortable distance. He had published military history books alongside his operational career. He had completed 6 tours of Northern Ireland. He had taught at the Staff College in Camberley. He had accumulated the kind of experience that makes a man very clear about the difference between what is being done and what needs to be done, and very reluctant to pretend those 2 things are the same when they clearly are not. His superiors would find him, at various points in the months ahead, genuinely annoying. This assessment was accurate and almost entirely irrelevant, because he was right about almost everything that mattered, and deep down they knew it. His first impression of Gorazde was recorded later with the directness that characterized everything he said about that entire deployment. What he remembered above all else was that as soon as you entered the confines of the enclave, a blanket of despair descended on you. That feeling of desperation and fear. It was not a metaphor. It was a physical sensation, produced by the geography of the place, the height of the cliffs, the darkness of the valley, the evidence everywhere of what 3 years of siege had done to a civilian population that had nowhere else to go. The regiment Riley commanded had been in continuous service for 306 years at the moment it entered Gorazde. Founded in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, it had fought under Marlborough at Blenheim and Ramillies, served under George II at Dettingen, which was the last battle in which a British king personally commanded his army in the field, and stood firm at Albuherra in 1811, where the 3 Fusilier battalions were sent against 9 French ones, and a historian wrote afterward that nothing could stop that astonishing infantry. It carried its colors through the Boer War, through the blood and mud of the Somme, through the Second World War in North Africa and beyond, and had arrived in Gorazde with a battle history so extensive that the regimental museum in Caernarfon cannot fully contain it. Why, its motto was 2 words: Ich dien, I serve. Queen Elizabeth II was its colonel-in-chief, not as a formality but as a sustained personal relationship between a sovereign and her regiment, one she had maintained with genuine commitment across the years of her reign. She was already scheduled to visit the regiment's base that same week the crisis arrived, a commitment made months before any of this was anticipated, arranged in the calm of a different season when nobody expected what was coming. That visit, that prearranged commitment, would take on a weight in the days ahead that nobody who scheduled it could possibly have foreseen. More than 90% of the soldiers in the 1st Battalion spoke Welsh as their first language. They had grown up speaking it in the valleys and market towns and farming communities of Wales, and had taken it with them into barracks and training and operations, and carried it now into a mountain enclave in eastern Bosnia, where it became something none of them had been trained to use it as. Riley recognized early in the deployment that the Welsh language was an operational advantage that no procurement budget could have produced and no enemy could counter. He ordered all radio communications to be conducted entirely in Welsh. The Bosnian Serb forces surrounding the enclave were listening on every available frequency. They could hear the traffic. They could identify that communications were happening. They could not understand a syllable of what was being said. It cost nothing. It required no technology, no encryption equipment, no classified protocols. It was simply the mother tongue of a regiment from Wales, doing the thing that mother tongues do when the people who carry them are placed under pressure. It worked completely. The world those soldiers moved into when they entered Gorazde had been stripped down to its essentials by 3 years of siege. Every scrap of burnable timber had been cut from the surrounding forest and hauled into the town for fuel, so that the cliffs and hillsides that enclosed the valley were bare in a way that made the enclosure feel even more absolute. Civilians lived entirely on United Nations food aid. No vehicle could move in or out by road without Bosnian Serb permission, and that permission was not forthcoming. The British battalion used mules to resupply its outlying observation posts, because mules can go where armored vehicles cannot and do not need roads that the enemy controls. Daily rations were cut to what the supply situation could support. They cooked on wooden fires. The electricity supply was intermittent at best and absent for days at a time, which meant the nights in Gorazde were genuinely dark in a way that people who have grown up in modern cities do not experience. Not the manageable darkness of a power cut in a town with ambient light from other sources, but the total, weighted darkness of a mountain valley with no artificial light whatsoever, and an enemy on the surrounding heights that would fire at any illumination it detected below. Riley slept during the day and went into town on foot every night, alone or nearly so, to maintain contact with the liaison officers from both the Bosnian Muslim army inside the enclave and the Bosnian Serb forces surrounding it. This was the fiction of UNPROFOR's neutrality made physical, the commanding officer of a British battalion walking through a besieged town in the dark to maintain the appearance of impartiality that the mission's mandate required. He described this routine later as almost a physical presence in itself. The darkness, the silence broken only by occasional sniper fire or the distant sound of artillery, the awareness that the forces on the heights above could see the town below them in a way the people in the town could not reciprocate, and were calculating every night whether the moment had arrived to act on that advantage. He understood what they were calculating, because he was calculating the same thing from the opposite direction, trying to read the signs and the pattern of the shelling, the positioning of the heavy weapons, from the radio traffic that his intelligence people were monitoring, and determine how much time he had before the situation moved from tense and static to actively catastrophic. The 11 Norwegian medical personnel under his command had become, in Riley's phrase, part of the family. They were not attached to the battalion, or liaised with it, or co-located alongside it. They were woven into its daily life with the completeness that comes from sharing a confined and dangerous space over months, from eating the same reduced rations and hearing the same artillery and depending on each other in the specific, practical ways that military units in difficult positions depend on each other. When two soldiers walked into a minefield, an incident that could have ended with both men losing their legs, it was the Norwegian medical team that treated them and prevented the amputations. Riley would call this, with the careful understatement that characterized his speaking style, a miracle. He meant it without irony. In Gorazde, in the spring of 1995, preventing two men from losing their legs to a minefield in a town under daily shell fire was genuinely miraculous by any reasonable standard of measurement. The battalion had been in Gorazde for less than 3 months when the events elsewhere in Bosnia began moving toward a crisis that would engulf them completely. In early May, Bosnian Serb forces seized United Nations heavy weapon collection points around Sarajevo and began mortaring the capital. The UNPROFOR commander, British Lieutenant General Rupert Smith, a Gulf War veteran who had commanded the 1st Armored Division in 1991, issued an ultimatum, and then, when it was ignored, requested NATO airstrikes against Bosnian Serb ammunition depots near Pale. NATO acted on the 25th of May. The response from the Bosnian Serb army was immediate, deliberate, and savage. They shelled 5 United Nations safe areas simultaneously. In Tuzla, a shell landed near a crowded marketplace cafe on a Tuesday afternoon. 71 civilians were killed. 150 were wounded. They were not combatants. They were the point. And then, in the days that followed, Ratko Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb army, ordered his forces to begin seizing United Nations peacekeepers as hostages across Bosnia. It was a planned, ordered military operation, I later confirmed as such by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The hostages were placed at bridges, ammunition dumps, radar installations, and military facilities, anywhere a future NATO airstrike might conceivably fall. Photographs of peacekeepers in United Nations, blue berets, chained to structures in their own uniforms, circulated across the world within hours. From that moment, NATO could not fire a single shot at the Bosnian Serb army without risking killing its own people. The strategy had worked with a simplicity that made the entire machinery of the international community look like exactly what it was: a system that could be defeated by a chain and a camera. On the 28th of May, 1995, the Bosnian Serb army came for the Royal Welch Fusiliers. The attack targeted the 4 observation posts and 2 checkpoints the battalion maintained on the west bank of the Drina simultaneously, without warning, at a time when the men at those positions were carrying out the routine duties the mandate required. They were observing, they were monitoring, they were doing the job they had been sent to do. The Bosnian Serb force that descended on those positions was large, heavily armed, and operating under direct orders from commanders who had studied the UNPROFOR mission and understood precisely what it would and would not do in response to an overwhelming show of force. The Fusiliers had light weapons and a mandate that prohibited them from initiating combat. They had no helicopter extraction available, no quick reaction force within reach, no artillery to call on. It's nothing that would have given them a realistic option other than the one they took. They were surrounded by a force they could not fight with what they had and what they were permitted to do, and they knew it. The officer and 31 men at the West Bank posts were taken hostage at gunpoint. They were disarmed on the mountainside where they had been keeping watch. They were loaded into Bosnian Serb military vehicles. They were driven northeast toward the town of Visegrad, where the others were already being held. They were soldiers of a regiment that had not broken in 300 years of fighting, and they were being taken prisoner, not because they had failed, but because the political architecture built around them had equipped them for a different war than the one they were in. They understood this. Soldiers always understand this faster than the systems that deploy them. They did not break. They did not panic. They went. The 3 outposts on the east bank of the Drina received their situation reports. The men stationed there learned within minutes what had happened to their comrades on the west bank. They were free, undetected, mobile, armed, and positioned at a location that was about to become the most important piece of ground in the entire enclave. General Smith had ordered all remaining UNPROFOR forces deployed around Gorazde to return to their base immediately. It was a sound order, the order that any military doctrine would have generated in those circumstances, designed to consolidate the remaining strength of the force and prevent further losses. The East Bank soldiers did not follow it. They linked up with Bosnian army reinforcements from the 81st Division, which was already moving to intercept the Bosnian Serb advance, and they went together toward the key hill that overlooked the town. What happened on that hill is the answer to the question that the title of this story is built around. Gorazde sits in a valley. The heights above it command everything below them. If the Bosnian Serb forces had taken that hill on the morning of the 28th of May, 1995, the town would have been finished. Not contested, not subject to negotiation, not capable of being saved by any combination of diplomatic pressure and parliamentary debates and artillery deployments and personal phone calls from prime ministers. Finished in the specific way that Srebrenica would be finished 6 weeks later, and with consequences that everyone who has ever looked at what happened in Srebrenica understands completely. The East Bank Fusiliers and the Bosnian 81st Division held that hill. The Serb attack was stopped. Riley would describe the outcome with the economy of a man who has learned not to embroider the truth. The Serbian attack was poorly coordinated, so they succeeded in preventing the Serbs from getting into the town, and they bought the Bosnian army enough time to strike back and stop the Serbian advance. 2 sentences. The difference between a city that lived and a city that would have been massacred is contained in those 2 sentences, and in the decisions of soldiers who chose to hold a hill when the order said to withdraw. The remaining observation posts were evacuated in a 3-hour fighting withdrawal, not a retreat, on an active extraction under fire, conducted by men who had just completed the most operationally significant action of their careers in a campaign that history would largely forget because it worked. The hill held, the town survived, and 33 of their comrades were in enemy hands. Bosnian Serb-controlled television broadcast the first images of the British hostages within hours of their capture. The Fusiliers appeared on screen in a canteen in Visegrad, smoking cigarettes, eating meals, alive and apparently unharmed. The families watching in Wales saw something no editorial framing could neutralize. They saw their sons. In Cardiff, Alan Warren was watching. His son, Sergeant Nicholas Warren, was 30 years old. Nicholas had done 4 tours of Northern Ireland. He had been tested before and had come through it, which was something his father held on to. His wife was expecting their 2nd child. The baby would be born while Nicholas was in enemy hands. Alan Warren told a reporter what was in his head, with the directness of a man who has no patience left for official language. He said he would like to see his son out, that he would like to see everyone's son out. Then he said the thing that cut through every layer of careful government communication around the mission. "Our lads are trying to keep the peace," he said. Now they are being made scapegoats. In towns across Wales, the same calculation was being made by different families. 12 British soldiers had already been killed in Bosnia since the first deployment in 1992. The very first had been Lance Corporal Wayne Edwards, 26 years old, a Royal Welch Fusilier shot by a sniper in January of 1993 while escorting an ambulance that was carrying 3 women to safety. His mother, Barbara Manley, was still living inside that loss when the images of the 33 appeared on the news. She said what she knew to be true. Our soldiers went to Bosnia to help. They were peacekeepers. They did not go to fight. Our boys cannot fight back. She was describing the contradiction at the heart of the entire mission, the same contradiction that had produced the gap between what the mandate permitted and what the situation required, and she was describing it with the clarity that comes from having already paid the highest possible price for it. In his command post in Gorazde, Riley received a message from Buckingham Palace. Queen Elizabeth II was the regiment's colonel-in-chief. She was already scheduled to visit the regiment's base that same week, a visit arranged months before in a different season when nobody had anticipated what May of 1995 would bring. She had known this regiment across years, and deployments, and ceremonial occasions, and the particular continuity that exists between a sovereign and a regiment. She has maintained a personal relationship with across decades. Its soldiers were hers in a sense that exceeded constitutional formality, and now 33 of them were in Visegrad, in a Bosnian Serb facility, dispersed across enemy territory as human shields against NATO aircraft that were no longer flying because they were there. Her message said the Serbs would not dare to harm any of her Royal Welch Fusiliers. Riley recalled those words many times in the years that followed, always with the same 4 words appended. As usual, she was dead right. That night, Riley wrote a personal letter to every one of the 33 soldiers' families. Not a form letter processed through a department, not a notification drafted by an aide and signed at the bottom. A letter from their commanding officer to their parents and wives and families, written in the voice of a man who knew their sons by name and by service record, and by the particular qualities that each of them brought to the battalion. The commitment he put into writing was simple and absolute. We are not leaving here till we have got those boys back. It was not a bureaucratic assurance. It was not the careful language of a man managing expectations. It was a commander's oath, made in the worst possible circumstances, to the people who most needed to hear it. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Riley's career, and he would go on to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan and Sierra Leone before saying so with any finality. All day long there was shooting at the town. At night, the darkness was complete, and the Bosnian Serb forces would fire at any light they detected. Up to 500 shells fell inside the enclave on the worst days of the bombardment. The civilians, 20,000 people, mostly Bosnian Muslims, who had been living inside this siege for 3 years before the British arrived, had no place to go that was beyond the reach of the artillery. They cooked on open fires. They carried water. They placed their children in whatever basements and shelters the buildings of the town still offered, and they waited, as they had been waiting since 1992, for someone to make a decision that would change their situation. Riley said it was as if a dark and heavy mist had come down on the town. Everyone felt it, both the soldiers and the civilians. He meant this in a literal sense, as well as a metaphorical one. The darkness, the accumulated weight of the daily bombardment, the isolation from any resupply or reinforcement, the knowledge that nobody was coming to help in any time frame that would make a practical difference. These were physical conditions that pressed on the body as well as the mind. The battalion had no road access to resupply, They ate rationed food. They cooked on wooden fires. They used mules. They spoke Welsh on their radios. And every evening Riley walked into the town in the dark to talk to people. Because a commanding officer who remains in his headquarters and receives information through official channels in a situation like this, one loses the texture of what is actually happening. And losing that texture in Gorazde in the summer of 1995 would have been potentially fatal for everyone he was responsible for. 5 days before the hostage crisis, on the 23rd of May, 2 Royal Welch Fusiliers armored cars were escorting a food convoy through the enclave when Bosnian Serb artillery opened fire on them. The crews returned fire in self-defense. Their vehicles were hit. Nobody was killed. On the return journey, the patrol encountered a heavily pregnant Bosnian woman who could not reach a hospital because every road out of the enclave was controlled by the forces that were currently shelling them. The soldiers stopped. In the middle of an active artillery exchange, in a besieged mountain town, in a vehicle that had just been struck by enemy fire, the Royal Welch Fusiliers delivered her baby. Then they drove mother and child to safety. There is no clause in any peacekeeping mandate that covers this. It happened because these were the soldiers who were there, and because it is apparently not in the nature of a Welsh Fusilier to drive past a woman in need, regardless of what the surrounding circumstances happen to be. Back in Wales, the families of the 33 were living through a particular kind of waiting that is different from most human waiting because the information is so incomplete and the stakes are so absolute. 6 of the soldiers were in hospital after a road accident during the transfer to Visegrad, none seriously injured. 8 were initially unaccounted for, a fact that had been raised directly in the House of Commons by a member of Parliament from Newport, who wanted the Prime Minister to address it specifically. The images on Bosnian Serb television showed the others in the canteen, alive, eating and smoking, waiting. Alan Warren counted the days and watched the news and waited for his son to come home to a second child who might arrive before him. The other families did the same, in their different houses and different towns across Wales, with the particular patience of people who have learned that there is nothing to do but wait, and that doing nothing feels like its own form of failure. John Major recalled Parliament from its recess on the 31st of May for an emergency debate, on the first such recall since the Falklands War. He stood at the dispatch box and told the House that the Fusiliers were thought to be in Visegrad, in good heart and good health, and that the government held Gorazde and Mladic personally responsible for their safe return. He refused to trade a cessation of NATO bombing for the hostages' release. He was not, he said, entering into that sort of blackmailing deal. He announced the deployment of artillery, 12 105mm light guns, the first time UNPROFOR had guns in Bosnia. He placed 24 Air Mobile Brigade, 5,000 men and women, on orders to deploy to the theater if the situation required it. The public position of the British government was clear, firm, and without ambiguity. Riley, inside the enclave under continuous bombardment, was running his own parallel campaign through channels that the UNPROFOR chain of command had not designed and did not welcome. He contacted politicians and decision-makers directly. He bypassed layers of the command structure that were supposed to stand between a battalion commander in the field and the people at the top of the political system. He pushed. He was described by those who found this approach frustrating as annoying. He did not stop pushing. UNPROFOR headquarters, genuinely uncertain whether the force commander in Gorazde had lost his judgment under the accumulated pressure of months of siege and direct enemy action, sent a British SAS team to assess him. The Special Air Service, on whose entire selection and training apparatus is built around identifying men who remain functionally rational under conditions of extreme and prolonged stress, were dispatched not to fight anything, but to evaluate whether Riley had become a problem rather than a resource. They arrived. They observed him at work. They delivered their assessment with the directness the regiment is known for. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was, in their judgment, the only senior officer in the visible chain of command whose response to the situation actually matched the reality of the situation. He continued. The director of military operations telephoned. Then the chief of the general staff telephoned. Protocol was being broken at each ascending level of the chain, an upward, through a structure that had been designed specifically to prevent this kind of direct communication between the front and the political top. One morning in early June, while the Bosnian Serb artillery continued its work outside, and the bunker walls carried the vibration of each impact up through the floor and into everything resting on it, the telephone rang again. It was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Major wanted a situation report from the commanding officer on the ground. Many officers, placed in that position with that caller, would have found the register that conveys seriousness without forcing a decision, honest enough to be credible, but measured enough to leave room for the management of expectations. Riley told the Prime Minister what was happening, so he described the enclave with the precision and the complete absence of diplomatic cushioning that had made him a difficult subordinate throughout the deployment and an invaluable presence inside the wire. He told him about the bombardment and the rate of fire and what 500 shells a day does to a town and to the people inside it. He told him about the isolation and the resupply situation and the medical constraints and the 20,000 civilians with nowhere to go. He told him about the mandate that said, observe, and the reality that required rather more than observation. He told the Prime Minister, as he would put it later, with the economy that was his natural mode, which way is up. Major spoke at the Welsh Conservative Party conference on the 9th of June, and he told the audience he had spoken that morning to Colonel Jonathon Riley in Gorazde. He told them about the armored cars and the artillery fire and the food convoy. He told them about the baby delivered under shellfire and taken to safety. He told them about the soldiers patrolling 140 miles of old front lines, making former enemies live alongside each other and begin the slow work of rebuilding. He spoke with the specificity of a man who has been given the unvarnished account by the person actually living it. Artillery moved towards Sarajevo. A rapid reaction force went on standby. A lieutenant colonel in a bunker had told his Prime Minister the truth, and the Prime Minister had responded to the truth rather than to the managed version of it. Simultaneously, in London, the Ministry of Defense was drawing up a plan that Riley was never told about. The plan described in precise operational detail how all 350 British soldiers would be evacuated from Gorazde if the enclave came under renewed Bosnian Serb assault. It required 30 helicopters, 14 attack aircraft, 1,500 frontline and support personnel, and an Italian airbase as the staging point. The planners estimated the actual pickup inside Gorazde would last no more than 10 to 15 minutes. A copy was delivered to Downing Street. Major read it and wrote on the covering document in his own handwriting. Not at all an easy option, he wrote. Cock-up factor clearly present. The plan was called Operation Screwdriver. It was marked secret and for United Kingdom eyes only. The commanding officer, who was writing personal letters to 33 families in Wales, pledging they were not leaving until the boys were back, did not know it existed. That document stayed classified for 25 years and was only reported publicly in 2021. The hostages were released on the 14th of June, 1995. All 33 came home. None had been killed. None had been seriously harmed. The international pressure applied to Belgrade had worked. The negotiations had worked. The Queen had been right. Riley's oath to the 33 families, written in his own hand, on the worst night of the crisis, had been honored to the letter. Nicholas Warren came home before his second child was born. The other 32 came home to the towns and villages of Wales, hunted to the people who had waited by their televisions and their front windows and their telephones for news that was slow to arrive, and then, when it came, was good. The cost of their release was paid somewhere else, and it was paid in a currency that the families in Wales had no way to account for and no way to refuse. On the 4th of June, French General Bernard Janvier, the overall United Nations Forces commander in the former Yugoslavia, had met secretly with Ratko Mladic. Mladic's demand was that NATO airstrikes against the Bosnian Serb army must stop. Janvier effectively agreed to this. The meeting was not announced. It was not authorized through normal command channels. It was not disclosed to the British government, which had its suspicions but could not confirm them. Its consequence was immediate and total. The credible threat of NATO military force against the Bosnian Serb army ceased to exist. 8 weeks later, the Bosnian Serb forces turned their full attention northward to Srebrenica, where 400 Dutch peacekeepers were lightly manned and unsupported, where the same dynamic of threatened harm to peacekeepers had already removed the prospect of air support, and where over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were murdered in the worst genocide on European soil since the Second World War. The Fusiliers had come home. The deal made to bring them home had taken away the only thing standing between Srebrenica and what happened there. Riley said it plainly, in the way he said most things. Everybody remembers Srebrenica because of all those people who died. People do not remember Gorazde because it was successful. He was not complaining about the absence of recognition. He was describing the mechanism by which history decides what to carry and what to leave behind, and noting that the mechanism favors catastrophe over survival because catastrophe generates the testimony that survival quietly absorbs. In August of 1995, when only 80 soldiers remained in Gorazde and the broader military and diplomatic situation had shifted enough that the enclave's future could be considered from a position of something approaching stability, Riley told General Smith they could not hang around and needed to leave. The battalion withdrew. 12 hours after the last Royal Welch Fusilier left the enclave, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force, with the air campaign that should have happened much earlier and that combined with Croatian and Bosnian ground offensives to finally produce the conditions that ended the war. A ceasefire on the 5th of October. The Dayton Peace Agreement signed on the 21st of November. 12 hours between the regiment's departure and the beginning of the end. When the 1st Battalion returned to the United Kingdom, they were awarded the highest number of medals and commendations of any British regiment since the Korean War. Riley received the Distinguished Service Order for gallant and distinguished services in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. He continued to serve in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Sierra Leone, rising eventually to the rank of Lieutenant General before retiring in 2009 with a doctorate in modern history and more than 20 published books and the particular kind of memory that belongs to the man who was actually there. In February of 2011, he appeared at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. Radovan Karadzic was on trial. Riley gave evidence about the events of May 1995, about the West Bank observation posts and the men taken at gunpoint, and what had happened to them and what had happened to the town in the weeks that followed. In 2013, he gave evidence again at the trial of Ratko Mladic. Both men were convicted. Genocide at Srebrenica. Crimes against humanity. The specific crime of taking United Nations peacekeepers hostage in the period from May to June of 1995. Both sentenced to life imprisonment. Appeals rejected. The commanding officer who had written 33 letters to 33 families who had told his prime minister the truth from a bunker under shellfire, who had held the line with 500 soldiers and a mandate that said, "Observe," went to The Hague and gave his evidence, and the men who had taken his soldiers were convicted of it, and he lived to see the verdicts come in. The Norwegian medical personnel who had served with the battalion, the 11 men and women who had been part of the family and had saved 2 soldiers from losing their legs, received the Norwegian Armed Forces Medal for Defense Service abroad on the 8th of May, 2017, 22 years after the events. Riley flew to Oslo for the ceremony. He said it was very emotional. He said what he had said in various forms over the years since. The Gorazde mission was by far the hardest thing he had ever done. Not Iraq, not Afghanistan, not Sierra Leone. Gorazde. First and hardest and most precisely remembered, in the way that the most demanding experience of a life does not fade the way the others do. In 2004, the British Army announced that the Royal Welch Fusiliers would merge with the Royal Regiment of Wales to form a new regiment, the Royal Welsh. In 2006, the merger was complete. One of only 5 line infantry regiments in the entire history of the British Army never to have been amalgamated, a regiment founded in 1689, whose soldiers had charged 9 French battalions at Albufeira and held a hill above Gorazde and delivered a baby under artillery fire and spoke in Welsh on their radios so the enemy could not understand them, and written letters to 33 families on the worst night of the deployment, was absorbed into a new formation. The name was gone from the army list. The history was not gone. The soldiers carried it with them. There is no monument in Westminster to what happened at Gorazde. No major film has been made about it. The histories of that summer devote their weight to the failures, to Srebrenica and the slow catastrophe of a war the international community could not resolve, because failures produce testimony in a way that successes cannot. A city of 20,000 people is alive today because of decisions made on a hillside on the 28th of May by soldiers who had been told their job was to observe, and who observed that the hill needed holding and held it. That is the whole explanation. It does not require anything added to it. They will tell you the war ended at Dayton. They will tell you the NATO air campaign of the autumn brought the Bosnian Serbs to the negotiating table. They will tell you it was diplomatic pressure and military force and the weight of what had happened at Srebrenica that finally resolved what 3.5 years of peacekeeping had failed to resolve. All of that is true. But before any of it was possible, in a valley in eastern Bosnia, on a morning in May when the politics had failed, and the mandate had failed, and the command structure had failed, the soldiers of the Royal Welch Fusiliers made their choices. They held the hill when they were told to withdraw. They went peacefully when they were overwhelmed, because fighting would only have meant their deaths. They delivered a baby under artillery fire. They spoke Welsh on their radios. They waited in Visegrad and came home when the negotiations worked. And their commanding officer wrote a letter to every one of their families and kept his word and told his prime minister the truth from a bunker under shellfire, and went to The Hague 20 years later and watched the men who had taken his soldiers be convicted of it. The Queen's message on the worst night of that deployment said the Serbs would not dare to harm any of her Royal Welch Fusiliers. She was right. As usual. The 33 came home. The town survived. And the regiment that had been told to observe and had found better things to do with their time had done what the regiment had always done when it mattered most. Ich dien. I serve. Now you know the story they forgot to tell.